From the University of Washington, the Walker Ames Lecture Series presents a lecture by Dr. Idwārd Saʿīd entitled Imperial Continuity, Palestine, Iraq and U.S. Policy. Recorded May 8, 2003. The moderator is Dr. Michael Halloran.
To introduce tonight's speaker is my colleague and longtime friend, Hazard Adams, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Comparative Literature. Professor Adams is one of the most distinguished members of the university faculty. He is known to many as a critic, a theorist, a novelist, a poet, and he is going to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Idwārd Saʿīd. Hazard?
Any proper account of Idwārd Saʿīd's intellectual life would reveal an astonishing breadth of interest and accomplishment. Some here may not know or may have forgotten that he is a distinguished literary critic and scholar. His books, Joseph Conrad and the Fiction of Autobiography, and Beginnings, both broke new ground. His collection of essays, The World, the Text, and the Critic, contains essays of enduring importance in the history of criticism in the last half-century. On a hot, muggy evening in Evanston in someone's living room some years ago, I heard and watched an apparently cool yet intense Idwārd perform splendidly on the piano. Perhaps some here do not know that he has written with authority on music in his Musical Elaborations, 1991, and with Daniel Barenboim in Parallels and Paradoxes, Explorations in Music and Society, published last year. But we are here tonight for an address on the politics of the Near East. It is the topic for which his work is most widely known today, though his specific present concern has frequently been expressed by him in larger intellectual contexts. That context is, of course, exemplified in one of the most influential books of the last half-century, Orientalism, where his literary and political interests enforce one another, and in the later Culture and Imperialism, plus numerous books on Palestine and related subjects. It's perhaps no surprise to us, given the number of books he has published and the range of his activities, that in his memoir entitled Out of Place, 1999, Idwārd Saʿīd confesses, quote, "I have no concept of leisure or relaxation," unquote. It is quite surprising, however, that he says he has no concept of cumulative achievement. We are surprised, too, to learn that he conceives of himself as permanently out of place until we realize that he has been almost everywhere that is intellectually important to be. In that sense, yes, he has been out of place, or rather in place, almost everywhere. Idwārd Saʿīd's work has been dedicated to bringing out of darkness that which has been ignored, forgotten, repressed, suppressed. There's an important moment in his memoir where he described looking at some old home movies taken by his father. I quote, "The films exclude so much, seem contrived and rigid as they positively ban any trace of the effort and uncertainty of our lives," unquote. He marvels how discussion of, quote, "the problem of Palestine and its tragic loss should have been so relatively repressed, undiscussed, or even remarked on by my parents." His work has been, as criticism should ideally be, a filling of such blanks. It is well symbolized by the title of his 1981 book, Covering Islam: How the Media and the Experts Determine How We See the Rest of the World. Idwārd Saʿīd's career has required bravery that belies the timidity he writes of in his memoir. He has had to endure insults, surely actionable, and he has had physical threats and attacks on his property. In his memoir, he writes, quote, "When I began to be involved with politics, both my parents strongly disapproved. 'It will ruin you,' said my mother. 'You're a literature professor,' said my father. 'Stick to that.' His last words to me a few hours before his death were, 'I'm worried about what the Zionists will do to you. Be careful.'" Care is the characteristic of all sound scholarship. Far rarer is passion and deep commitment to truths that are ignored, forgotten, repressed, suppressed. It's my honor to introduce Idwārd Wadīʿ Saʿīd, whose topic is Imperial Continuity, Palestine, Iraq, and U.S. Policy.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to mention that and recognize the family of Rachel Corrie, whom you may recall was tragically killed. Well, it's not the right word, tragically, but horribly killed, I should say, by an Israeli bulldozer in the southern Gaza town of Rafah. She was part of the international solidarity movement with the Palestinian people and was there heroically trying to prevent a 60-ton bulldozer, Israeli bulldozer, from flattening a Palestinian house. And for her bravery and commitment, she was bulldozed into death. Her parents and her sister are here. I wish they would just stand so that you can... I'm convinced that during and since the end of the American and British war against Iraq, the word America and its adjective American have been used more times than ever before by everyone. Certainly not a moment goes by without the media proclaiming what America has done and will do, as does the government, as well as all the various spokespersons who purport to speak for all of us as Americans. Along with the word America have gone the pronouns us and ours, used repeatedly for our forces, our plans, our democracy, our values, and so on and on. There's never been a time when the flag has been as much in evidence as now, displayed all the way from jacket lapels to gigantic buildings, and accompanied with the sundry rituals of verbal patriotism, loyalty, and affirmative national identity. Surrounded by all this, I find myself recalling a wonderful story about the great playwright and novelist Samuel Beckett, who, as you perhaps know, he was Irish, but lived most of his life in Paris. He was a reclusive, taciturn, and extremely gnomic and elusive man. And he was accosted once in a Paris post office by a Frenchman who seemed to be fascinated by his appearance. "Are you English?" said the inquisitive Frenchman. There was a brief pause. Then Beckett said, "On the contrary." And thereafter fell completely silent. The beauty of this story is the superb ambiguity, of course, of Beckett's response. Whatever the contrary of being English is or may have been, Beckett didn't specify. But he made it very clear, at least, that as for labels like English, French, or American, he wasn't going to have anything to do with them, nothing positive to say about them, positive in the sense of affirmative, patriotic, or even so much as a simple designation. On the contrary. I'm going to talk about the American situation today, but not in strictly speaking affirmative and positive ways. We're all Americans here, yes, But what is being done by the official America, does it correspond to what we are and what we want? I shall argue no. And that the whole issue of what America is or says it is very much up for grabs, and certainly as citizens, it's our duty, I think, to enter the fray. Despite what General J. Garner, proconsul and major contractor in Iraq, was quoted as saying, I quote him now, "We ought to look in a mirror and get proud and stick out our chests and suck in our bellies and say, 'Damn, we're Americans.'" To which I say, on the contrary. Nevertheless, I don't have any ready formula for what is America or American, because I shall argue, as I did in my book Orientalism, that identities are very much made or constructed in comparison with other similarly constructed identities, and that the America that we see today in the Middle East, for example, is something that needs to be examined and rediscovered for the formidably complicated and frequently destructive thing that it really is, despite all the festivals of joy and victory that we seem to be celebrating about what happened in Iraq and may happen again elsewhere in the region. My own view is that there are many Americas, and that very pluralism is precisely what is so unique and precious about this amazing country. Its immigrant population, its diversity of races and cultures, its openness to the whole world. I believe all that is now threatened by a narrow, chauvinist view of America that dominates the country by the current Washington administration, turned in on itself, threatening our basic freedoms and most of all our democracy, as well as threatening the world itself in hectoring, belligerent, moralistic and intolerant terms and actions. Even though I shall have a lot to say here, of course, I realize that I can't say everything or get even close to covering all that needs to be said. So feel free later to raise questions. But first a word or two about history and interpretations of history, interpretations, that is, that depend on the perspective of who speaks, who is being spoken to, and for what reason. And this, far from being an idle academic or intellectual game, is the key to politics, which, as the English political philosopher John Donne puts it elegantly in his incomparably intelligent book, The Cunning of Unreason, Making Sense of Politics, is never, he says, politics is never passion, ludicrousness, or even misery. But politics, I continue quoting, but politics is always how human beings see their world. Above all, the role and significance of one another in making it what it is, and how they choose to try to master it, to bend it to their wills, how they judge, and how these judgments impel them to act. Often, perhaps on careful examination, always, mastering it includes, and perhaps principally requires, subduing, eluding, persuading, or enlightening one another. End of quote. Most of our fellow citizens have an understandably vague idea of what Middle Eastern, and more particularly Arab history is, and they have only the most general idea of what American policy in the world at large actually is. Certainly the mass media is most unhelpful in this respect. But from the point of view of most Arabs, there are facts that need to be acknowledged and understood before we, as Americans, presume to make generalizations about democracy and terrorism and politics, not only in the Arab world, but also in this one. As both an American and an Arab, I chafe, and indeed become angry when I hear dogmatic statements about Arab violence and American materialism, for example, because both seem to me reductive and simply wrong. There's an important role in such political discussions for the role of history, remembering Donne's comment about politics. Politics is trying to bend history and how to judge and how these judgments impel us to act, this is what politics is. There's an important role, therefore, in political discussions for the role of history and for that of intelligent understanding. Let me try to provide some of that. The Arab world, from the Mediterranean to the eastern borders of Iraq, and, I mean by the Mediterranean, I don't mean just the eastern Mediterranean, I'm talking about the whole of North Africa, the Levant, and then to the eastern borders of Iraq, has been ruled by outside powers, that is to say non-Arab powers, continuously since the 16th century. First it was the Ottomans. Then after they were defeated in World War I, it was the British and the French. Then after World War II and the discovery of vast amounts of oil, it was the United States and Israel, which has become a regional superpower with a formidable army and nuclear arsenal, much of it supplied by the United States. True, there have been independent governments in the region, but all of them, without significant exception, operated in an atmosphere of national emergency. Hence the distortions and despotisms that have occurred there, one of them, of course, the government of Saddam Hussein. These despotisms and distortions have occurred there as a result, as a reaction to outside powers trying to control the Arab world. And these governments and policies there, it must be added, took place in a general atmosphere of what was called anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggle. The early years of post-war, post-Second World War independence in the Arab world were marked by such outside interventions as the 1956 Suez War, the French War in Algeria, and the effects, of course, of the Cold War. Since 1967, Israel has been in military occupation of the Palestinian territories, and this after the destruction of Palestine, of Arab Palestine, in 1948. The Syrian Golan Heights are still occupied, as until recently were a large part of South Lebanon and the whole of the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. In the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, etc., all the countries there operate now as American protectorates. All are oligarchies threatened from the outside for their oil and their strategic position. Today, the United States is in military occupation of one of the largest and most significant Arab countries, Iraq, and shows no sign of leaving there anytime soon. You'll understand from all this that in Arab eyes, there is no real independence here, a situation compounded not only by the new colonial occupation of Iraq, by the U.S., whose government and mass media have conducted also an unremitting onslaught against the Arab people, their culture and their traditions, but also by the rule of mostly military, unpopular governments, Arab governments, who claim to be in power as a safeguard against further outside intervention. Every Arab will tell you that these are unrepresentative, these Arab governments in place now, are unrepresentative and repressive governments that derive, in the end, from the fate of living in an area which, for all sorts of cultural, geopolitical, religious, and historical reasons, outsiders have had designs on what they feel is their land, their world, their resources, and their fate. Perhaps the essence of what I'm talking about, of this sense of being threatened from the outside, is embodied in a recent front-page New York Times photograph that shows a swaggering Donald Rumsfeld leaning back expansively in the huge main cabin of what seems to be his personal jumbo jet, en route to Iraq and the Gulf, surrounded by what seem to be dozens of aides, bodyguards, generals, and experts who ring him like courtiers surrounding Caligula in one of his flying imperial palaces. Then, when he arrives in countries like Qatar and Kuwait, he's shown being greeted with abject, welcoming smiles by local potentates in flowing robes, faceless and nameless, but to everyone concerned, are known to rule their little fiefdoms at Rumsfeld's pleasure. He is the conqueror of Iraq, and indeed it would seem of the world. In the background are the string of US military bases from the Gulf to the northern Caspian Sea in about 15 countries, to say nothing also of many, many more bases in dozens of countries elsewhere in the Pacific, European, and Northern commands. To an Arab seeing all this, a new outside power has come to change lives there irrevocably. You will appreciate that this is not a pleasing prospect. So in short, I think it's wrong to say that imperialism ended. It didn't. Although, in fact, the British and the French empires may have ended. It continues today in forms that, as Americans, should make us feel deeply uncomfortable and dissatisfied with the fact that we are following, as an empire, in the footsteps of all the others. I've spent a lifetime studying empires. Every empire, in its official discourse, says that it is not an empire, that it's different, and that it has the unique history and power to do things for culture and civilization and democracy that no one has attempted before. Lodged at the very heart of the official American undertaking in the Middle East is the same imperialist thing, except that Bush, Rumsfeld, and the others have a media and many intellectuals who have internalized the official and much reiterated theme of American altruism and beneficence and never question or are bothered by what it is that we do. That is why one is grateful for occasional glimmers of edifying honesty, such as was offered recently by Michael Ledeen, a member of the Pentagon's advisory group and a veteran of the Iran-Contra scandal, now the holder of the Freedom Chair at the American Enterprise Institute. I quote, "Every 10 years or so," he says, "the United States needs to pick up some small, crappy little country and throw it against the wall just to show the world we mean business." In fact, however, most of us are lied to and manipulated. Journalists were embedded in military units and saw only what they were allowed to see. Moreover, everything they wrote had to be approved by the Pentagon. That was why the Arab satellite channel Al Jazeera, which I see, I have a satellite dish and I can see it regularly, was many times more informative than CNN, for example, and the panel discussions on Al Jazeera much more interesting, since in the US media, dissent was mostly absent, and ignorant so-called experts were relied on to provide prepackaged cliches about the Arabs and the Iraqis that simply reinforced what had already been decided upon by a small clique within the administration. The case against Iraq as warranting an enormously expensive and destructive war, now estimated at about $80 or $90 billion, was, in my opinion, entirely confected to conceal and disguise the two reasons that wars are usually fought for: material interests and conquest. According to right-wing commentators, George Bush was brave, progressive, and get this word, moral, in invading Iraq. I quote David Brooks on the Nightly News Hour. A less indulgent view sees what George Bush did as having very little to do with Iraqi democracy, as witnessed the terrible chaos there now and the manifest incompetence and unpreparedness of the US occupation regime in dealing with it, and with the wanton looting and pillaging that continues even now. Besides, this is the main question, who assigned us the role of bringing democracy to Iraq? Every American needs to ask that question. Every American needs to ask that question very seriously. Beyond the self-glorification of our totally self-invented mission, the real reasons for this war were oil and domination. And this is why there's been a convergence between extremist Israeli and US hawkishness. Ask yourself the question, if Iraq had been the world's largest exporter of oranges, would there have been a war? And were it not also the only Arab country that, because of its wealth and the advanced development of its people, might have been a threat to Israel's domination, not its existence, but its domination, would Menachem Begin have bombed it, would have not bombed it in 1981? Of course, that was why it was bombed. And that was why the US invaded it, because it had oil. Just look at the list of reasons that were so cynically hawked about by Bush and his lackeys, and see how all of them fade into nothing immediately. First of all, no weapons of mass destruction were found on the almost cosmic level that had been claimed before the war. Iraq, and of course, some of the media, I mean, you take Judith Miller of the New York Times, who's there every day to assure us that they're about to discover that they thought they found them, that some defector did it, but then he changed the story and the weapons were not found. She reports this every single day in what is considered the newspaper of record. She's a disgrace to her profession and to the media in general. Another reason, Iraq was portrayed as an imminent threat. This is the phrase, I'm quoting directly George Bush, that Iraq is an imminent threat to the security of the United States, 7,000 miles away. Rubbish. As the 20 useless missiles fired incompetently by the Iraqis into the Kuwaiti desert amply testify. Another false claim, Iraq's is a fearsome military machine. Nonsense. The war was over in 3 weeks because, as the media never remembered to mention, Iraq was a country with a population already bled dry by the US and British sanctions, its population decimated by repression and malnutrition, the morale of its people sapped, and the reality of its culture and human actualities completely effaced from public consciousness. Another claim, that the US stands for democracy, and by destroying Iraq as it is, democracy will emerge. The source of this particularly outrageous Orientalist claim was the inbred and opportunistic circle of Iraqi exiles who told their US patron what they wanted to hear, as well as dubious authorities like Bernard Lewis. Now, I want also to say that there's no example in history of democracy, which is undefined in this case, of democracy being brought in on the barrel of a gun, despite the facile analogies made with the cases of Germany and Japan after World War II. The fact is that aside from pillaging and chaos, the US has in fact created two new things in Iraq by invading the country. One, a new, highly militant Islamic movement in Iraq, which it doesn't have the means at all to handle or understand or circumvent. And second, it's created a coalition of US-approved, quite unrepresentative groups, including corrupt exile leaders with no constituency in Iraq, and two Kurdish groups who have a lot of scores to settle with Iraq's Arab majority. So this is the immediate result of our invasion to bring democracy. The same flawed logic applies to the US's appalling ideas and plans for what it will do now. Like Israel, after its reinvasion, I should say, of the West Bank last spring, the US wants the world to pick up the tab for the damages the Bush government has caused. This is why, understand it. They now want the UN there because they want the UN to pay for what they did. And it also wants Iraq to become a happy hunting ground for every rapacious corporation in the book, with a militant anti-Arab, anti-Muslim Likudnik like Paul Bremer, now in charge. He's a trustee of the Jewish Institute for National Defense. The prospects for a future country in Iraq look dim indeed. This America is following in Britain's imperial footsteps there. But unlike Britain, unfortunately or fortunately, you decide, we don't have a cadre of colonial administrators. We don't have a corps of Middle Eastern hands or Arabists to rely on. All that seem to be present are ideological hawks whose ideas come out of their head and books they've read, and whose ideas are dominated by a virulent pro-Israel and anti-Arab bias at the expense of the lived experience. all of it at the expense of the lived experience of actual, real people. It makes you weep. As for the argument that Iraq, I'm still going through the list of arguments for the war, that Iraq had violated UN resolutions. You remember, it's violated the UN resolutions, as George Bush said. Well, it's true, it did violate them. But the violations by Israel and the United States have been far greater. The ineffable Richard Pearl has delivered himself of the standard American line when he said in The Guardian, shortly after the war ended, that the UN was dead and deserved to die. What didn't occur to him, or to anyone else, is that the UN was not created to serve the US's imperial vagaries, but exactly the opposite. This was a war universally acknowledged, therefore, to be illegal and immoral. The whole of the world felt that. What a dreadful precedent this has set for the US and for other states who may wish to claim God and good and then intervene militarily against some weak country next to them. The UN's refusal to go along reflected the world majority. No one, not even the American electorate, which was not consulted anyway, has given George Bush, who apparently prays himself into goodness every morning and evening in readiness for battle against evil, no one gave him the right unilaterally with Tony Blair to go to war so brazenly. What I find particularly galling is the condescension in the whole plan, in the way it was described. The assumption that the American people that listened to all the bilge about freeing Iraq was that the way they thought the American people who listened to all that was little more than an assembly of moronic school children, despite the misleading, not to say manipulative, polls that gave Bush such an illusory support for mayhem and rapacity abroad. So it is true, as Tony Judd has brilliantly stated it in the New York Review of Books, the issue of May the 1st, and I quote, that if you want to understand how America appears to the world today, I hope I'm not insulting too many people, consider, he says, if you want to understand how America is viewed in the world today, consider the sport utility vehicle. Oversized and overweight, the SUV disdains negotiated agreements to restrict atmospheric pollution. It consumes inordinate quantities of scarce resources to furnish its privileged inhabitants with supererogatory services, which means unneeded services. It exposes outsiders to deadly risk in order to provide for the illusory security of its occupants. In a crowded world, the SUV appears as a dangerous anachronism. Like U.S. foreign policy, the sport utility vehicle comes packaged in sonorous mission statements. But underneath, it is just an oversized pickup truck with too much power. In the Arab world, America is now mainly known for its interest in oil, its disdain for Arabs and Muslims, and its blind, unconditional support for Israel's systematic human rights abuses of the Palestinian people. In all, an intolerable record of extremism, sheer sadistic cruelty, and obdurate willingness to accept the equal existence of another people. It is not at all accidental that the American campaign in Iraq and before it in Afghanistan against world terrorism has been cynically accompanied and exploited by General Sharon, who must have been jolted on a June day last year to have heard himself described by George Bush as a man of peace. In this country, we are all so used to cliches about Israel's democracy and its precarious existence that we're simply unable to see what, behind all the murk and the propaganda about wanting peace, Israel has really been about, with full U.S. backing. The Iraq campaign bears all the marks of Israeli attitudes to the Arabs. from the racist idea that they only understand the language of power, to the arrogance of trying to impose their will upon everyone, to the notion that if they don't fit in the area, then the area has to be changed by military means. Look what Sharon did in Lebanon in 1982, and the 17,000, mostly civilian Palestinians and Lebanese, he was responsible for killing when his armies tried to change the Lebanese regime and failed. Look also at what Israel has always done to the Palestinians. I'll come to that in a minute. But for an honest statement of what Israel is really about, it's not about peace, here is the Israeli Chief of Staff, Moshe Ya'alon, saying that the aim of Israel's policy is to lead the Palestinians, now listen to this, to internalize in the deepest recesses of their consciousness that they are a defeated people. This is Israeli policy stated candidly, and I must say with admirable clarity. Remark that this is not a new policy, but comes on the heels of a long campaign to erase Palestinians from any human or political consideration. Well-meaning liberals who consider that all the problems for Israel began in 1967, people like Susan Sontag, for example, are lulling themselves into an illusion, since the Zionist assault begins in earnest with the destruction of Palestinian society in 1948 and the total dispossession of the Palestinian people, the loss of their land, and their statelessness ever since. In a trilogy of powerful books entitled The Land Without People, another one, the second one called The Expulsion of the Palestinians, and the third one called Imperial Israel and the Palestinians, the Palestinian-Israeli scholar Noor Masalaha has unearthed both the theory and practice of emptying the land of Israel of its indigenous inhabitants. Much of the pre-state ideology that mobilized Eastern European Jewish communities for the trek to Palestine, which was held by Britain in the first part of the 20th century, was premised on the virtual absence of inhabitants. The virtual absence of inhabitants on what was often depicted as either a completely empty or a hopelessly arid land awaiting redemption. Later, or in some cases simultaneously with that contention, when the discovery of actual Palestinians could no longer be deferred or denied, there was a concerted effort to devise ways of spiriting them away, for which the War of 1948 provided field commanders and David Ben-Gurion himself a rich opportunity to get rid of Palestinians. This policy is amply attested to in the Israeli military archives, as combed assiduously by a number of Jewish as well as numerous Arab researchers, including Masalaha himself. Since 1967, the desire to efface and or repress what has remained of Palestinian life in the cities and villages of the West Bank and Gaza has remained an often explicitly Israeli goal, recently hidden inside the polemics of a war for Israel's survival and a defense against terrorism. But whether its new Jewish citizens liked it or not, Israel was always encumbered by Palestinian memory, which is one of the things I'm focusing on here. It's not as if a whole existence of a people can be easily wiped away like a footprint in the sand. The sheer banality of such a possibility is too obvious to require more comment here. What I would like to note is that the power of memory in the Palestinian collective mind has persisted. The more Israel has unilaterally exerted its considerable force to bury the Palestinian past, as it were, there has therefore been a painstaking collective and yet uncoordinated Palestinian memory that has maintained Palestinian history since the disaster of 1948. Palestinian cinema is one result. What has remained of the vastly dispersed fragments of history since 1948 have been painstakingly collected by Palestinians over time as objects of memory. Such things as house keys, title deeds, photographs, letters, embroideries, and so forth. And through film, fiction, poetry, oral discourse, critical and political analysis, significant or traumatic collective experiences like the Deir Yassin, Kufr Qasim, Sabra and Shatila massacres, and the Jenin events of last spring. The significant episodes of Palestinian suffering have been preserved along with the national life that bore and outlived them. I remember writing in 1982, during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, that whenever one of us had an opportunity to speak in public, there was a requirement to start narrating the collective national narrative as if from scratch. No freestanding Palestinian story was available that could place before the world the chronological sequence of dispossession and catastrophic loss that has so disfigured and mutilated contemporary Palestinian life. Such a sequence has been interdicted in all sorts of ways, far too many times by such things as the carting off by Israeli soldiers of Palestinian archives in Beirut during the 1982 invasion. And only last year, the Israeli occupation army similarly removed records, computers, hard drives, statistics from Palestinian offices at the Central Bureau of Statistics on the West Bank, the Ministry of Education, and elsewhere in the occupied territories. Whether this was meant to put a stop to Palestinian national life, just short of full ethnic cleansing, I don't want to speculate here. But that such procedures are of a piece with claims that Israel is fighting for its life, and that in occupying and destroying everything possible by tanks, bulldozers, F-16s, and Apache helicopters, which were also used in Iraq by Americans, it is defending itself against terrorists who happen to have no army or viable defense or means of waging war of any description. That seems totally obvious. In any event, the great narrative of Palestinian life hasn't yet been achieved, or for that matter written, any more than the fulfillment of its logical national aspirations have been fulfilled, although it seems just as obvious that there is no regression, no flagging among Palestinians everywhere on that inexorable drive. Despite all this, a Palestinian nation in exile or in waiting has emerged with an unmistakable outline and personality of its own. And it has attracted heroic supporters such as Rachel Corrie to come and join the ranks in solidarity with the struggle for human rights and Palestinian rights in particular. The vast networks of institutions, groups, and collectivities scattered all over the world that sustains the continuity of Palestinian national life is an amazing thing. It has drawn not only on the mobilized energies of Palestinians everywhere, but also on the widespread, the dazzlingly widespread commitment to them of their friends, allies, and comrades all over the world. The obstacles placed before the path of the Palestinians on a daily, minute-by-minute basis cannot be overestimated. Each of them a conscious, willful abuse of human rights, collected from literally everywhere in the history of colonial brutality against indigenous people, but now protracted into several different regimes of oppression. Note, please, first, the utter inequality of power between stateless and dispersed Palestinians and the collection of Arab states who offend their humanity, who dehumanize them, but who nevertheless house them. There's a story in yesterday's or today's paper about refugee Palestinians in Iraq who are housed in Iraq where they had no place to go, and today, as a result of the end of the regime of Saddam Hussein, these same the continuation of the tragedy is so horrible. These same 40,000 Palestinians who were given homes in Iraq because they were kicked out of their own homes are now being kicked out of the homes by Iraqis who say these are their homes. And of course the Palestinians have no place to go. In countries where Palestinians have been fortunate enough to acquire citizenship, there are invidious laws that discriminate against them as somehow different from the rest of the population. This is sadly true even in the United States. Inside Israel, non-Jewish Palestinians are underrepresented. They are juridically not allowed rights of immigration, land acquisition, or leasing. These rights are automatically accorded the Jewish citizens of the state. Since late 2001, extra pressure on them as a community has been applied, even though they represent over 20% of Israel's population. As for the West Bank and Gaza in particular, where Rachel Corrie lost her life, the 36-year-old military occupation, now the longest and most brutally sustained in modern history. You don't ever get that on the news. You say Palestinian violence or extremists, but you're not reminded, as you should be every day, that this military occupation has been there for 36 years without a let-up for 1 minute. This has taken a horrific toll on the human condition of the Palestinians on every level. In fact, short of genocide itself, I cannot think of a single one of their human rights as a people that has not been violated with a kind of refined viciousness designed to dehumanize, break their spirit, and humiliate them to a degree that is simply stupefying. What's made it worse is how much of this has been willfully shielded from witnessing eyes by propaganda about fighting for survival against terrorism, claims that in any other instance would defy the credulity of the most gullible intelligence. The sheer inequality between the average Palestinian and the average Israeli is breathtaking, and you're never shown this on television. You will say something disapproving about those terrible suicide bombers, Palestinian suicide bombers, and I will agree. But how many Israelis have had to live through the demolition of their houses, of entire villages, blocks of flats, shopping districts, by bulldozers? How many Israelis have had to endure missile attacks by Apache helicopter or rockets from American-made F-16 fighter jets? How many Israelis have to be stripped and searched at checkpoints on an hourly basis, as every Palestinian has to be stripped at checkpoints, 300 checkpoints on the West Bank and Gaza, manned by 17 and 18-year-old Israeli conscripts carrying M16 rifles supplied by us. During the first 3 weeks of the present Intifada, 1 million bullets were fired by Israeli military personnel at Palestinians. Neither the Indians demonstrating against the British, nor South African blacks fighting against apartheid faced anything like this, nor for that matter did they have to reckon with missiles, hundreds of tanks, helicopters, and F-16 and rocket attacks fired into civilian areas as well as refugee camps that have no defenses and no arms whatever. Consider that on the internet, I picked this date from the recent past, for January 23rd, one can read, for example, 836 Muslim pilgrims, Palestinian pilgrims, to Mecca from Gaza were denied permission to leave. The Catholic cardinal, Palestinian, was detained at Tel Aviv airport and not allowed to leave. Some towns on the West Bank have already sustained 240 days of 24-hour curfew, that 150 dunams, 4 dunams to an acre, of fertile, this is on one day, of fertile agricultural Palestinian land were razed in Gaza. That 3 people, 2 of them civilians, were killed and 6 homes demolished. That 62 shops in a small town on the West Bank were flattened to the ground. And that literally thousands of people, many of them pregnant women, sick and aged men and women, children trying to get to school, doctors hoping to reach their patients in their hospitals, professors and undergraduates desperate to get to their classes, with 3 universities closed, and ordinary human beings shopping, looking for food or work, all these detained on that day by the endless number of checkpoints, over 300 of them, that punctuate the existence of Palestinians in the occupied territories. A week ago, 12 Palestinians were killed as a result of an Israeli incursion into Gaza. Dozens more injured, tens of houses demolished. What the US press has never done is to keep a daily tabulation of how many Palestinians are killed every single day. Israelis and Palestinians. No civilians should be killed. But you'll see the vast preponderance of Palestinian deaths. And they are all induced by military means, and many of them are children, many of them are women who are sick, and many of them are ambulance drivers, journalists, volunteers like Rachel Corrie, killed by the Israeli occupation forces. In varying degrees of severity and brutality, this sort of thing has been going on there every day for 36 years. As in the meantime, dozens and dozens of new settlements have been set up on Palestinian land. Conversely, how many Palestinian settlements have infringed on Israeli property? None. How many daily armed incursions, sometimes with 60 tanks? 60 tanks! That's, in proportion to what the U.S. used in Iraq, that's 10 times the amount for a much smaller population. We're talking about 3 million people on the West Bank and Gaza. One village with maybe 4,000 people, 60 tanks enter the village. We're talking about, 40, 50, 60-ton tanks and 60-ton bulldozers coming in little defenseless villages and towns on the West Bank that have, of course, no artillery, no army, How many Palestinian tanks have penetrated Israeli towns and villages? How many Israeli fields have been burned? None. With all the ritual and fuss surrounding the planting of trees in Israel, does anyone bother to recall that an average of 896 Palestinian trees per day have been uprooted by Israeli settlers and soldiers since the beginning of the Intifada in October 2000? For this kind of continual brutalizing assault, the United States and Israel designed a peace process that lasted 10 years, which was not even supposed to put a stop to all this, but rather to make it seem slightly less unbearable. Yes, a peace process requiring thousands of hours of negotiations to make Israel stop, which of course it didn't at all. And now the roadmap comes in to do more of the same. Cover up what is actually going on in the territories. And the most galling thing is today in the New York Times, Dennis Ross, who has returned to his position as an employee of the Israeli lobby in Washington, the man who was put in charge of, quote, the peace process, is pontificating again about how the Arabs have to do this and the Arabs have to do that in order to take advantage of Israel's generous offers. I mean, how galling can you get? You have to use your memory to keep in mind that since the current Intifada began and Mr. Ross began his work in the Clinton administration as trying to continue it into this one, representations of all this have been available on the international media simply do not render anything like the harsh awfulness of what life is for a Palestinian on a daily basis in Gaza and the West Bank. The efforts of Israel's spin doctors, says Tim Llewellyn, the veteran BBC reporter, the efforts of Israel's spin doctors, the US government and media in conjunction with a weak Arab communications operation have usually combined to make Israel's broad version of events prevail. These continue to give the impression of a struggle between equal forces, a beleaguered and misunderstood Israel occasionally forced into excessive measures to clamp down on terror versus hordes of recalcitrant Palestinians careless of Western value and endemically suicidal for obscure religious reasons. Making the astonishing illegality and inhumanity of Israel's policy, which many Israelis have objected to, many more than Americans, making it even more difficult to recall this policy and see, not only for outsiders, so to speak, but even for Israelis themselves, is that, as Amira Hass writes in Haaretz, she's a wonderful Israeli correspondent who has lived first in Gaza and then on the West Bank. She writes much more critically of Israel than any American journalist has ever done in the mainstream media. She writes for Haaretz, which is the Israeli New York Times. I mean, that may not be a great compliment, but I quote her, a person, she says, could travel the length and breadth of the West Bank without ever knowing not only the names of the villages and cities whose lands were confiscated to build the Jewish settlements and neighborhoods, but even the fact that they exist. Most of their names cannot be found on the road signs. And from a distance, the calls of the muezzins and the streets empty of people seem like an aesthetic decoration. A Jew traveling on the almost empty roads of the West Bank would think that there were no longer any Arabs. They do not travel. They are not allowed to travel. Can you imagine the racist discrimination? These are roads for Jews only. Arabs, you have to go on the dirt roads. And I'm quoting her. They do not travel, they're not allowed to travel on the wide roads used by Jews. End of quote. It is equally significant of the assault on memory and visible reality that the entire Gaza Strip, which contains over 1.3 million Palestinians and a mere 4,000 to 5,000 Israeli settlers who control the water resources, as they do elsewhere in the occupied territories, and are protected by thousands of Israeli soldiers. The entire Gaza Strip is surrounded by an electrified wire fence, making Gaza, as an Israeli journalist has noted, in effect a gigantic cage. Both Ehud Barak and now Ariel Sharon have pressed ahead with the building of a fantastically expensive wall, 25 feet high and 12 feet across, or 8 feet across, running the entire length of the West Bank from the north to the south, almost 250 miles, at a cost, obviously, that we're going to pay as taxpayers, of course, which, quite apart from destroying more Arab land and separating towns from their farm acreage on a vast scale, is designed to blot out the existence of Palestinians. I mean, South African apartheid, they were kids compared to this. This is delusional. This tremendous assault on dignity, on memory, on reality, is quite without precedent or analogy in our postmodern times. Not in former Yugoslavia, nor in Africa, nor elsewhere in Asia and Australia. By contrast, however, I'd want to remark that all these efforts have not achieved their goal. In every possible way, the diverse actualities of Palestinian identity, far from being a negative or passive things, have grown first and foremost a culture of human rights and democratic process. We don't need to get it from the United States. It's at the grassroots level that has included a sensitive register of the claims of memory, the demand for attention and justice, despite the world's indifference, and a healthy awareness of the ironies of unequal power. The other fact I'd like to note before closing is that even though in the US and parts of Western Europe the notion of Palestine is associated invidiously with the idea of violence and terror, there is, as I said earlier, a serious contradiction to that association between Palestinians and violence in an ongoing and recognized Palestinian national life with a quite peculiar, if not outright, tenacity to it that has simply overcome all the terrible ordeals placed in its way. There is today a Palestinian literature, a Palestinian legal, political, and scholarly discourse, a Palestinian cinema, a Palestinian theater, a Palestinian oral tradition, a large number of Palestinian grassroots and political organizations all over the world. In short, a Palestinian style that invigorates and informs all aspects of this far-flung community's existence. There was a coherent Palestinian national life well before Zionism appeared in Palestine. Palestinians sent representatives to the Ottoman Parliament in 1876, before Herzl had written his book about Zionism. The universality of the drive for Palestinian self-determination has acquired now an unbudgeable place in the world's, but not the American, agenda for liberation and resistance. Every major UN conference for the past 2 decades women, the environment, racism, human rights, disarmament, health, human development, has had an important place in it for the question of Palestine. Paradoxical though it may seem, the Davos meetings for governmental and corporate leaders has an important component of its agenda devoted to Palestine, while at the other end of the world, in Porto Alegre in Brazil, at the anti-globalization meetings, the presence of a large contingent, Palestinian contingent, is featured, whose presence assures an additional progressive dimension to the debates there. Any discussion of Middle East peace turns out inevitably to be mainly about the question of Palestine. But who, and I think the world majority is in favor of Palestinian self-determination. It's only a group of extremist hawks in Washington and in Tel Aviv who resist it. If in the period after 1948 Israel had the status of a progressive cause, it is now Palestine that has taken that place. One needs only think of the support Israel in the post-war period had from such people as Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir to gauge how far from that position it has today fallen. As some of its local homegrown critics like Amos Elon and Avishai Margalit have noted, sadly, since the Intifada, first Intifada of 1987, Israel has been transformed dramatically the world over into a symbol of oppression and injustice, lumped together with the U.S., and this is really the theme of my talk, for its imperial arrogance, its supremacist attitudes, and for its inhumane policies towards the Palestinians over which it has ruled for so long. And very important has always been the presence of an increasing number of Israelis fighting their own government's policies in favor of Palestinian human rights. Problematic and humanly a very compelling issue, the challenge posed to conscience and consciousness by the Palestinian people raises a whole raft of questions about the post-Cold War political order that are quite unique in their density and difficulty. Contentious and noisy though some of these issues may be, I want to bring this lecture to a close by looking just very quickly, or noting a few of them, as dispassionately as I can, now that the so-called roadmap has been released. The first, for us as Americans, is actually quite simple, but has been clouded over by an enormous amount of cant and euphemism, not only by neocons, but a whole slew of liberal commentators who have spoken favorably about imperialism in general, and American imperialism in particular. There's no doubt that the United States has behaved as an imperial power, as has Israel as a sub-imperial power, mainly because no one seems capable of stopping them, except, of course, for their own citizens, us as Americans, Israelis, as the citizens of their government. What we all saw in Iraq is, or ought to be, compellingly repugnant to us as a people whose republic was born out of the desire to be free of the imperialist rule of an earlier power. For us to go around the world imposing our will militarily, or having it imposed by people who do not, in the final analysis, represent values of independence, but rather those of hawks, business executives, who are cynically ignorant contempt for other people, and see imperial situations like that of Iraq as an opportunity to land lucrative contracts, and ideological pundits who have convinced themselves that the U.S. abroad represents altruism. This is the craziest idea I've ever heard. All of this is a major disaster for our country. Think of the vast amounts of money, the hundreds of billions of dollars wasted on imperial exploits, money which could far more profitably be used here for schools, for universal health coverage. It's a disgrace. It's so embarrassing as an American to be asked, how come you don't have it? I mean, every country in the world does, except here, because it says, we're told it's socialism. Whatever that's supposed to mean. That's like Beckett saying, on the contrary, I say. So I think this money, 120 billion is now what they're estimating for Iraq just in the next few months, could be used for schools, hospital, and housing for the immense number of needy people in the United States. Second, imperialism always brings untold suffering on the colonized. And it breeds feelings of hatred and vengeance, much greater than any of the rewards offered by such Panglossian projects as building democracy for others. Third, imperialism encourages the worst instincts, including racial hatred, national identities dedicated to the extermination or subordination of others, and economic greed, to say nothing of instilling in the imperialists all sorts of illusions about his power and his ideas, including even the maniacal notion that people hate America because they're jealous of us. We have an almost awakened citizenry in this country. But we must become aware of the fact that whether we like it or not, the world is too small a place either to hide in the vast American hinterland or look away from what is being done in our name. Palestine is an example of these kinds of escapisms, a place of injustice and suffering imposed on its people with U.S. backing. We must no longer turn away from the world we have been a part of ever since the Republic was born over 2 centuries ago. The obligations of citizenship enjoin upon each American the duty not to pretend not to know when cruelty is visited on others in our name and with our support. It doesn't... What I cannot understand is how we are supposed to feel okay that bombing by B-52s at altitudes of 30 and 40,000 feet are part of an advanced technological military. What is that supposed to make us feel? Good? That we can do it by hurting? I mean, that's the structure of terrorism right there. Hitting innocent people with these bombs they can do nothing about. The obligations of citizenship require us, therefore, to take back our ideals and become, once again, a secular republic rather than a faith-based empire. An empire that wreaks havoc, punishment, and devastation where we have gone, all in the name of what in fact is the oldest of all military doctrines: to divide, to plunder, and to rule. I, for one, reject that, as I'm sure most of you here also do. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Saঈd, for your thoughtful critique, your passionate call for a sensible policy, but one that will lead to peace. It was obviously very inspiring. We now have an opportunity for questions. When you entered, you had received, or if you wished, a card. We're going to collect them. We have volunteers, and I have a few to start with. So if I may, it's a big one, but obviously a central one. Will there ever be peace in the Middle East? And if so, what will it take to bring it about?
I think there will be, but I've come to the conclusion that even with the tremendous will and resourcefulness and bravery of the Palestinians fighting the daily immiseration they have to face by Israeli occupation, there has to be a change in U.S. policy. It seems to me absolutely clear that Israel could not be doing what it's doing now, which is basically to reject and to stand in the way of what is obviously its international obligation, namely to vacate the territories it occupied illegally in 1967, and thereafter to recognize the sovereign existence of the Palestinian people in its own state, that Israel cannot continue to refuse to do that were it not for the unconditional support of the United States. That is to say, I'll give you a perfect example. The roadmap, which is a plan to bring peace between Palestinians and Israelis, a plan written by the so-called Quartet, the Soviet Union, Russia, the United Nations, the United States, and the European Union, has been accepted outright by the Palestinians. The Israelis have not accepted it. And Sharon has said that he will not accept it until he comes to Washington in June and to speak to George Bush about his, I don't know, I've heard 15 objections, I've heard 100 objections he has to it. But the intransigence of Sharon and his people would not be possible were it not for the support of Washington. And Washington would not be possible were it not for the fact that it takes for granted the quiescence, the somnolence, the passive acceptance of most Americans in just accepting this as a matter of fact. The fact is that the United States supplies Israel with $5 billion a year. That's $10 million, more than $10 million, almost $15 million a day that come out of our tax dollars. And unless we say this is not in our interest, we are creating enemies of not just of the Islamic and Arab world, but of the whole world, compounded now by the Iraq war. This is not in our interest as a people. It's unjust, and it causes misery. We are subsidizing the misery and suffering of others. Unless we say that, then the policy will simply go on and peace will never happen, because people don't give up that easily. Sharon and his tanks will continue. They get them from Washington. They don't pay for them. And I find that outrageous. They're using American weapons to kill innocent Palestinian women and children, and men and boys and everyone. And we just sit back and say it's okay. Why? Because most people are pretend they don't know, are afraid of being called anti-Semitic, don't want to take on the Israeli lobby. I mean, one could give a lot of reasons for it. But this, in the first place, this is money that should not be spent abroad in any case. It should be spent here where we need it, on tremendously crisis-ridden areas like education, like, as I mentioned, health insurance. I mean, there are thousands of things that we could better spend the money on here than supplying Israel with more tanks and fostering this incredible illusion that Israel is at risk. Israel is a major superpower now. It has an arsenal of 200 nuclear weapons. It has the most advanced air force in the world after the United States. It has a navy. It has every kind of artillery, and is supplied by us with anti-missile defenses. What's that all about? It's simply a suicidal policy for the United States and for Israel. And unless we, as American citizens, exercising our sovereign right to have a say in foreign policy, to have a say in the expenditure of the dollars that we pay the Congress through our taxes, this will go on more or less forever. So my idea is that we need an enlightened, an emboldened, a mobilized people, not just for peace between Palestinians and Israelis, that's terribly important, of course, but also for the other derivatives of that problem, which are the militarism and the kind of imperialist idea towards the whole world, that we are somehow outside, you know, perfectly and arrogantly expressed by Bush when he abrogated refused to sign the Kyoto Protocol on pollution. We all live in the same world, and the problems of the world are interconnected. Terrorism, the environment, human rights, they're all part of the same pattern, and we have to be able to see them that way. And until we act on the basis of our real human obligations and entitlements, there'll not only be no peace in the Middle East, there'll be no peace anywhere. And I think this is really one of the things that an imperial power wants. It wants to create, as I said at the end of my talk, to divide and rule, to keep the world in a state of perpetual anxiety, so that American dominance can prevail. I'm against that. I think it's immoral, and it is leading the world into areas where all kinds of new problems are emerging. And I think, as I say, the key to the whole thing is citizens' awareness and action.
Professor Saঈd, do the Zionists have any historical claim to the lands of Israel?
Of course, but I would not say that the Jewish claim or the Zionist claim is the only claim or the main claim. I say that it is a claim among many others. Certainly the Arabs have a much greater claim because they've had a longer history of inhabitants, of actual residents in Palestine, than the Jews did. If you look at the history of Palestine, there's been some quite interesting work done by biblical archaeologists. You'll see that the period of actual Israelite, as it was called in the Old Testament, dominance in Palestine amounts to about 200 to 250 years. But there were Moabites, there were Jebusites, there were Canaanites, there were Philistines, there were many other people in Palestine at the time and before and after. And to isolate one of them and say that's the real owner of the land, I mean, that is fundamentalism. Because the only way you could back it up is say, well, God gave it to us. Yes, but I mean, Christians think that God gave it to them, and Muslims think that God gave it to them. I mean, that's not a rational argument. So I think the people who have a history of residence in Palestine for a certain amount of time, including the Jews, yes, and of course the Arabs, have a claim. But, and this is very important, I don't think any claim, I don't care whether it's given by God, about whom I have many doubts, by the way, or by the emperor, nobody has a claim that overrides all the others and entitles that person with that so-called claim to drive people out. I mean, that's the point. This is a very, very important point. I mean, Jews have a claim, and I've never denied that. Of course they do. But is it a claim that can tell a Palestinian, well, you've got to leave this house because I mean, I got it 3,000 years ago. I mean, it's true I come from Poland or from Brooklyn, but I have a bigger right to this house than you do. So get out. I'm sorry, I disagree with that kind of logic. And if there was some way, as there seems to be now, there is a formula accepted by the world, and shared also with many Israelis and many Palestinians, many Arabs, for sharing the land. I mean, I think that's the better way to look at it, than say, no, one claim is superior to all the others.
Professor Saঈd, could you expatiate on something that you raised in your talk, namely the rise in Arab nationalism as a result of the Iraq War and what that means for the rest of the world?
Well, I didn't really talk about the rise of Arab nationalism. The rise of Arab nationalism is much older than the recent war in Iraq, but I certainly think that most people in the Arab world watching the war, not on CNN, which gave a very distorted view of it, well, or television is essentially a distorted medium, but just watching the war in the Arab world. I happened to be in Cairo, actually. I arrived in Cairo on the very day that Rachel Corrie was killed, and I was still in Cairo on the 19th when the war began. And from that perspective, you get a different view. Most Arabs felt that the destruction of Iraq was a terrible thing. Iraq is a central, Baghdad plays a unique, I say, the most important place in the history of the Arabs as a people, of any city. It was the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, which lasted for about 500 years between the 8th and the 13th centuries, destroyed by the Mongols. And in modern times, it's the cultural, intellectual, and even technological center of the Arab world. So the destruction of Iraq by high-altitude electronic bombing was felt as a humiliation and a defeat by every Arab. There was no love lost. Nobody cared much about Saddam Hussein. Everybody thought of him as a rogue and a terrible dictator. There's no argument about that. But the sense of invasion of the Arab space by an outside power, namely America, has increased. I suppose that's a form of Arab nationalism. And I think there's also a general feeling around the world, it's not exclusively an Arab thing, but I think there's a feeling in which many people share it, namely, what is the United States doing over there in the middle of Iraq? We're going to be, The Army and Jay Garner and Paul Bremer and all the rest, and Bechtel and Halliburton and Standard Oil, and we're going to be there for a very long time. And the attempt to try to redraw the map of the Middle East is not going, which Paul Wolfowitz announces every day at breakfast, is not going to be accepted idly. But people don't take kindly to someone. I mean, we know that from history. There are always movements of resistance to colonial intervention, colonial domination. It was the history of the French Empire, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Belgian Empire, and so on. And I think this will happen there too. So I think that's very important to consider. And last point to be made is there really is a very strong cohesion between different kinds of Arabs who speak the same language, who read the same books, watch the same television, share a history. As I tried to say in my talk, there's a sense that our area has been targeted for colonial intervention since the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, invaded the place in the 16th century. It's still going on. So I think the kind of reactive nationalism will occur. It may take Islamic forms, as it already has begun to do in Iraq. But not only that, there are secular forms of resistance, which I think are beginning to emerge. There is, for example, in the Arab world, an Arab human rights movement, there's an Arab women's movement, there's an Arab environmental movement, there's an Arab freedom of expression movement, there's an Arab secular movement, there's a very strong Arab democratic movement fighting on several fronts. You're not only fighting despotic regimes, but you're also fighting an outside American force which is trying to come in the country and plunder and rule it for its own benefit. So, you know, the situation of the Arab today is to take refuge in a collective Arab identity. It's a natural, I think, consequence of the configuration of forces.
On a different topic, could you speak to the issue of the human rights of Muslims and Arabs in the U.S.?
Well, I could speak about it to a certain degree, but it's quite clear to everyone here that since 9/11, about which, as you notice, I didn't speak very much, because I think there's been a tendency, I mean, there's no denying that it was a horrible atrocity, but there's been a tendency to exaggerate its importance and to turn it into excuse for all kinds of terrible behavior, including racist discrimination against people who we think are our enemies and deserve to be treated as second-rate or alien or somehow enemy peoples. And it's in this context that Arabs, Muslims, people of color from the Indian subcontinent have been treated with great disdain for their civil and political rights in this country. All you have to do is to ask an Arab or a Muslim or an Indian or a Pakistani or an African coming into the United States. First of all, it's much harder to get visas now. I mean, there's a whole subject to be talked about immigration, because this is a country of immigrants, and for us suddenly to say we only want white people, or if you're Swedish you can come in, but you can't if you're a Palestinian. I mean, that is, to me, unacceptable, because America was based on the notion of openness, of boundaries. And what makes us unique and strong and interesting as a people is that openness. Well, that's being threatened by the Patriot Act, by the Terrorist Act, by the practices of John Ashcroft and the Bush administration. And I think every Arab, I've written this in several things in the past year, every Arab and every Muslim in this country is made to feel like an enemy alien. It's emphasized by the media. I mean, how many times, you know, you talk about Arabs quoting the elders of the protocols of the elders of Zion. Well, that's an outrageous thing to do. It's a terribly slanderous and anti-Semitic work. But, on the other hand, how many times have you seen on American television Arabs referred to as camel jockeys or towel heads? How many movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger killing hordes, dozens of Arabs, just spray killing them all? The Arab is an object of hatred, of violence, of terror, and Islam as a religion of violence. Franklin Graham, Jerry Falwell. These are important figures in the in the United States. And this has added to the climate of antagonism and bellicosity. The slander of Arab civilization, of Arabic culture, all of these things have made it very difficult for Americans of Arab and Muslim and subcontinental descent to survive this period. But again, I think there's now beginning a reaction to this.
A very different question, just to change the pace for a second. What's your favorite novel?
The one I just read.
Which was?
Flaubert's Sentimental Education.
Okay.
I mean, I taught it also.
You paint a picture of an entirely innocent Palestinian victim. What of those who, long before 1948, expressed dreams of vanquishing Jews from their land and who continue to do so today? How can Israel respond to such threats?
Well, look, consider it this way. There was the establishment by force of a new Jewish state for Jews and only for Jews in lands that were principally populated by Arabs. This was a process that began at the end of the 19th century, culminated in the war between the Arabs and the Jews in 1947 and 48, which the Arabs lost. It meant the end of and the destruction of a flourishing society and country. Two-thirds of the Arab population became refugees. It's difficult to treat that with pleasure and a sense of welcome. I mean, you know, everybody has had the experience of losing something very important in their life, but a collective loss on that scale necessarily involves in the people so affected feelings of resentment, of anger, of vengeance, and all sorts of other things. I think it's an entirely natural thing. I think it was a fundamental injustice done to the people of Palestine. I never, ever use the words innocent or guilty. Never. Because what does it mean to talk about national entities as guilty or innocent? However, there is more guilty and more innocent. And I think in the relationship between Arab and Jew in Palestine, the preponderance of suffering has been that of the Arab, not of the Jew. The Jew, of course, suffered terribly in the Holocaust, in the genocidal and great waves of persecution in the Christian world, anti-Semitic persecution in the Christian world. But so far as Palestine is concerned, Palestinians played no part in the Holocaust. They were the ones who were sinned against rather than the sinners. And Arabs, this is not to say that Arabs are exonerated. I could go into all of that. I'm not going to bother, really. Of course, Arab states and Arab individuals, etc., have done horrible things. There's no question about it. But I'm talking on the collective level. Palestinians have lost everything. Israeli Jews have everything. What we need is a settlement of this, a righting of the, restoring of the balance, let's say. There are two peoples. They have to be able to live together in the same land in some equal and equitable way. You cannot have a people permanently repressed any more than you could have it in South Africa under apartheid. And it will not be sustained in Palestine because the Palestinians will simply not give up. I mean, neither will the Jews. But why people like Moshe Ya'alon, the Israeli chief of staff, says that he's expecting the Palestinians to behave like a defeated people, it simply hasn't happened. And it won't happen. We know that from history. The Algerians fought the French for 130 years, but in the end, they got their independence. So I think the struggle will go on, but in this case, it's a special struggle, because the Jews also have a special history of suffering. And there are now more and more Jews in America and Israel and elsewhere who are willing to see that and to join the struggle. And I think that's, in Palestine, is the only hope. I said first, a change in the US policy, but also very important, a change on the ground where Palestinians and Jews struggle together against injustice. I mean, that seems to be... I mean, it's very important to say this over and over again. There is a massive injustice now being done to one people by another. I mean, as I said in my talk, if you show me an example of Palestinian tanks invading an Israeli village and destroying 60 houses and killing volunteer workers like Rachel Corrie and destroying the lives of a whole village of Israelis, I will condemn it. In fact, I do condemn it right here and now, before it happens. But at the same time, I expect people to condemn what is happening to Palestinians by Israeli military force, when Palestinians are unarmed, they're undefended, and they're simply abandoned to this terrible fate every day. Where, I mean, one has to be able, Israelis, I think, should be able to deal with their own soldiers and say, look, this is not a war of our national existence. This is a war of oppression against another people. It's a colonial war. Some have already refused to serve in the occupied territories, and I salute them for that. And that's not about innocence and guilt. It's a question of justice and injustice, of the moral obligation to refuse orders that are manifestly unjust and are issued as collective punishment against a largely defenseless civilian population.
A question about U.S. imperialism. Do the dangers of U.S. imperialism always outweigh the potential benefits of foreign military intervention? Or are there cases where fascist or totalitarian brutality might justify limited intervention?
I agree with that. I mean, yes, there are some cases, like when the United States is attacked by a large armed force, as happened. Well, I can't really give any examples of when it happened, but when it happens, I'm for self-defense. I think, yeah, I'm not a pacifist, by the way, don't get me wrong. So I'm certainly for defending the United States against attack. I am not for the idea of defending the United States by attacking countries 8,000 miles away on the off chance that they might attack in the next century, and therefore... But as for American intervention, I think it's a very complicated subject, and I refuse to accept the idea that we are an altruistic power. Look what we did in Germany and France, and Germany and Japan, after, of course, we destroyed them. Well, there was a Cold War. It was in our interest to rebuild Germany and Japan. Yes, I mean, it was a great thing to do. I'm not for a moment putting it down. But it's not an uncommon, that's what I'm trying to really hit at, is these caricatural, ridiculous attributions to countries and civilizations of are they good or are they evil? I don't know. I mean, they're both. And the United States, is a country. It's not a person. And countries act in country-like ways. And I think those can be discriminated, they can be analyzed, they can be judged. And I'm not saying that every intervention, everything America does abroad is bad, is imperial. I don't think that. For example, the United States has a long history, an honorable history, of attempting to establish places of education. I mean, many people from the United States have gone to the Middle East, for example, my part of the world. My own history, my family's history, is intimately tied to the United States by virtue of education, American institutions of education, schools, colleges, universities in the Middle East. Those are very important things, as are the volunteer workers like Rachel Corrie who go out, express solidarity, live with and become part of the human community. But I'm talking about military intervention that can be quite easily analyzed as having to do with control and dominance. And I think that is something that needs to be opposed. As I said, I'm a historian of empires. And all of them go the same way. There isn't a single exception. They all do the same thing. They all say the same thing. They all say they're bringing democracy and enlightenment. And people speak out of different sides of their face. De Tocqueville, the great student of American democracy in the United States, who was very critical of the United States when it came to its treatment of the Native Americans and the African Americans. The moment France enters Algeria, he's the biggest imperialist of the lot. I'm serious, really. He thought it was for the glory of France that it should destroy Algeria, the natives of Algeria. So, I mean, one has to be able to have, I think, a consistent set of standards, humane standards, humanistic standards. And in the end, I think it's important to oppose great power. I think great power acts, in the end, immorally. There's no such thing as a great, beneficent power. This ridiculous thing that people like Michael Ignatieff and I can't think of Fareed Zakaria and all these recent pundits, liberals, who claim America, well, it's a benign empire. Well, You know, it's an oxymoron. As my friend, the late classicist Steele Commager used to say, it's an oxymoron, benign empire. It's like saying military intelligence.
Let me, if I may, pose
I'm running out.
One last question. But it's the one that is the most common thread throughout all the ones that I've had a chance to look at. And it goes something like this. What specifically can we do to change U.S. policy to help bring about a just peace in the Middle East?
Very clear. We must join the rest of the world in our policy. The European Union, the Organization of African Unity, the non-aligned, I mentioned the European Union, the Asian powers. In short, the entire world, with the exception of Israel and the United States, and I think Costa Rica and Micronesia, who always vote against these things, have had before them a set of UN resolutions that are in the books now, at least since 1967. We went to war in Iraq saying that he violated UN resolutions. Well, we've done the same. It is the only honorable thing to do, and to expect our representatives to vote, instead of sending letters, dear colleague letters, to the White House, having senators who are, you know, puppets of the Israeli lobby, writing letters and say, Israel should be supported against Palestinian terrorism. We should tell these so-called representatives of ours that they don't know what they're talking about. That in fact Israel has violated, as we have violated, UN resolutions, UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions that make it quite clear that Israel has to end the occupation, withdraw from the occupied territories of 1967, including Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, and accept the world consensus. There's not, when you think about it, there's nothing to be negotiated on. These are occupied territories. We need people like Rummy Rumsfeld to tell us these are so-called, well, they were occupied in 67, and according to the UN, according to the World Court, according to international law, according to every known standard, Israel has no right to be there. So, we need to mobilize our communities, our representatives in Washington, to tell them this is what we want. We want the United States to follow its own precepts, supposed precepts in Iraq, in the Middle East, to say to Israel, out. The time has come. It's not about, there's nothing to negotiate. You don't negotiate over illegal occupied territory. It's like negotiating on the theft of a house. What are you going to negotiate about? You get half a door back, or maybe just a garage? You negotiate the return of stolen or illegally occupied property. So it's basically so simple that we must demand of our own government, and especially of the Congress, that the United States ought to comply with the accepted world consensus as embodied in resolutions 242 and 338, passed originally in 1967, still on the books, affirmed, confirmed, etc., many times. The U.S. is talking about vetoes. We've vetoed, 60 resolutions on things like the occupation of Jerusalem and the annexation of Jerusalem, all kinds of things. At last we come back to the basic proposition that this is a land for two peoples who have to live there, not one people on top of the other, or one people ruling another, but two people in equality, in full self-determination. It's a very simple program. And this is the will of the citizens of the United States, who are members of the world community. We're not a race apart. We're not a special people in that sense, that we are set a different agenda. I think that's wrong. And I think